In the Pollinator Party this year, we have a great lineup for you. First, we're going to talk about the business case for pollinators. Then we're going to go into community engagement and tips on how to do gardening in your own space. We're going to host a science mythbuster panel to answer your biggest myths about pollinators. And we're hosting a huge pollinator BioBlitz competition. And those that have the most number of observations can win $100. So get ready. We're going to pump you up about pollinators.
The city of Portland and Metro spoke to me. They thought there was a good opportunity to do a pollinator project in this right-of-way. And what they wanted to do was help with that aspect, but also remove the invasive species and replace it with low-growing pollinator species. And so I thought that just works perfect for what we try to do in our group, is promote low-growing, sustainable plant communities.
We have very much history in the Pacific Northwest in terms of supplying power in a public sense to the region. And so it fits right up there, I think, with protecting the environment for the common good in the Pacific Northwest. Bonneville's service region is huge, and we have 15,000 circuit miles of line, and some of those are in fee owned. So Bonneville's in a very unique position to do a project like this, because pollinators take advantage of this type of vegetation, and they move through the landscape. And so when we have these rights of way available to them, they take advantage of it, and it's in a way it connects them to other habitats. Bonneville has such a unique position in being able to support that.
Hello, good afternoon. I am Jessica Fox at the Electric Power Research Institute, and we're very happy to host a conversation today about the business case for biodiversity and pollinators. We have executives joining us today from three different organizations. The first is Mark Frommuller, who's a Senior Vice President of Corporate Development and Environmental Strategy and Innovation at Ameren. Ameren is a Fortune 500 investor-owned utility serving 2.4 million customers throughout Missouri and Illinois. We are also joined by Sandy Nessing, Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer of American Electric Power. American Electric Power is also an investor-owned utility, one of the largest electric energy companies in the United States, serving 5.6 million customers across 11 states, all the way south from Texas up to Michigan and West Virginia. And lastly, we're joined by Nancy Sutley, Deputy Mayor of Energy and Sustainability with the City of Los Angeles. She was formerly Chief Sustainability Officer of Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, the largest municipal water and power utility in the United States, as well as serving in the White House Council of Environmental Quality during the Barack Obama administration. I'll just kind of set the stage and then we'll kick it off into a conversation. So the Biden administration has set a target of 80% renewable energy generation by 2030 and 100% carbon-free electricity and 5 years later from that. And simultaneously, under the Endangered Species Act in the United States, we already have 1,600 plants and animals listed and 300 more coming, including the iconic monarch butterfly that we're anticipating a listing decision for in December later this year. So let's kick it off. And Sandy, I'll start with you. Sandy Nessing at American Electric Power. How does biodiversity and pollinators fit into your organizational priorities as you try to tackle this clean energy transition?
Thanks, Jessica. I think that the first and foremost point is that we can't deliver or produce reliable, affordable electricity without nature. There's an interdependence there between the industry and nature that's essential, but is often overlooked in terms of the value of nature. And as we build and maintain new and existing infrastructure, we have to be mindful of and manage the impacts that we're having on wildlife and ecosystems. At AEP, what we do is we follow a hierarchy: avoidance, minimize, and then mitigate to guide our efforts and really manage those impacts that we're having on environmentally sensitive areas. We disturb a lot of land. Let's face it, we're as much in the construction business as we are in the power production and delivery business. And so, and restoring land is very expensive. And then you have to maintain those rights of way, for the duration of the life of that asset. So one of the things that we've been doing at AEP for the last several years is some pilots in 3 states, in Ohio, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, to use native seed mixes in place of turf grasses for revegetation of these disturbed areas after construction. And we're having some really good luck with that, and we're tracking the economical and ecologically, how well we're doing to protect wildlife and biodiversity by incorporating native vegetation. Land restoration, as I said, is really expensive, and those native seed mixes, while they may be a little bit more expensive on the front end, on the back end can potentially save us millions of dollars in O&M for vegetation management. And at the same time that we're doing that, we're protecting, preserving, and attracting pollinators and wildlife, which thrive in these environments. So it's definitely part of our business.
Well, it sounds like you've been able to sort of navigate this question. You're an investor-owned utility. So you have investors, you have shareholders, you have shareholder resolutions in some cases. So navigating kind of what are your shareholders, investors thinking about this additional potential cost related to biodiversity and pollinators? How can you justify it and make the business case for it?
Well, I have to say that right now we don't get a lot of questions about biodiversity and nature loss, which is a bit alarming, right? Because we're in a spot right now where we need to be, being aggressive. We need to be aggressive because the challenge before us is that we have to halt biodiversity loss, the impairment of ecosystems, and the damage to the natural capital upon which the economy is based. So it is alarming in one aspect that, we're not getting those questions from investors. We're not getting those questions from management either, or the board. And I think it's because they have a hard time wrapping their head around natural capital. When they think about capital, they think about it in financial terms. And so I think we're at the very beginning of really educating both investors and other stakeholders about why this matters so much.
By use of or implementing a biodiversity policy and being respectful of pollinators, we really do reduce our operation and maintenance budget to maintain the lands. So rather than have woody and brushy plants and shrubs in an area, it is much better for us to have the native plants that fit the area. It's easier for the workers to get in and out. It's less maintenance to actually take care of the properties. Those properties, obviously, with those plants are more friendly to the environment where we live, including stormwater runoff. Otherwise you'll get compacted soil and you'll have a lot of water runoff from rains. This way we get better infiltration through the soil, which is good. We'll get better carbon reduction, CO2 capture through the plants. And so it's really not at odds with our policy as an investor-owned utility and driving an implementation of infrastructure. Now, to the point, though, we do have to make sure that we can route infrastructures through the right properties and so forth. And so at times it may not be the most optimal route that we have to pick, because we have to balance landholder issues and we have to balance issues around municipalities or counties. And so therefore, we do have to work with all of the stakeholders in the process. And so balancing cost to take a longer route that might be more environmentally friendly, we may have to sacrifice a little bit there, but we have to work that out with the landholders, the stakeholders, municipal governments, county governments, make sure everybody's on the same page.
So, I mean, there's a lot on deck here with trying to find where all the new ground-mounted solar is going to go, and then there's the associated need to upgrade the transmission system to handle those additional kilowatt hours they're going to have to travel through the grid over the next, 10, 20 years. So does it, how do you kind of balance this paramount goal of climate and meeting renewable portfolio standards with simultaneously trying to support biodiversity and pollinators? And does that always make sense, or is there times that it just doesn't, it's not possible to get everything done at once?
Yeah, and I don't know, Jessica, if it ends up being binary. It means it is absolutely supportive and biodiverse, or it is absolutely not supportive and biodiverse. And so when we go through our planning, what we really want to do is holistic planning to make sure we're not building something or putting in an infrastructure when we don't have to. So let's be sure that we're exploring appropriately sized DERs so that they're in the right place to serve customers. If we can get greater capacity out of existing infrastructures, I'm referring to wires, then we should do so. We should look at enhanced technologies to get more throughput through the infrastructure. So then you come to the point where we must build something. Now we do want at the table from the outset biodiversity as an issue, along with what do we need, where are the customers, where does it need to go? And then you're solving holistically as you go. You don't want biodiversity or how do I care for pollinators as a back end after you've made all your decisions. So by putting it up front and making sure we're looking at everything and listening to the stakeholders, because many of the stakeholders will want biodiversity also. Sometimes, though, it would have to cut through a parcel that just isn't appropriate, or the government or a county government may not be on board with that. So we'll have to work with a different routing. Nonetheless, even in the new routing, you still want to make sure that you are implementing what is possible with regard to biodiversity, the right plant species, and supporting pollinators when you do that.
And so when you consider it up front, then the cost of it can also be integrated into a capital budget versus an afterthought where the cost of restoring habitat sometimes hits your discretionary or like sustainability budgets. Is that right?
That is correct. That is correct. So if we think about it up front, which is absolutely the right way to do it, you balance it out with all the quadrants of the sustainability value proposition, it then is it is part of the capital project to put that infrastructure in, and so it's treated as a capital expense. If you're going through and you're now after the fact trying to do something to an area, it would be your operating and maintenance expense, which is much more difficult for us. And it is much better, obviously, to balance out the solution with the stakeholders up front and get it treated as a capital expense.
So, Nancy, what are your thoughts? I mean, that you have I'm guessing you may have a slightly different perspective. You've been working with public agencies for a long part of your career, and now working with the city of Los Angeles. What are your thoughts on how do pollinators and biodiversity kind of fit into these public agency priorities? And what do you think about what Nancy said about having to balance cost and value of it?
One thing I'd start out with is the city of Los Angeles is a biodiversity hotspot. We have, hundreds of species, plants and animals, and it's important as we, that we share the space with nature, especially in an urban area like Los Angeles, and do things that we can do to preserve biodiversity. Because it's important for our city, it's important for the planet as a whole, that we can maintain these biodiversity hotspots and help species to survive and thrive, even in a densely populated urban environment. So I think that's the view that we've taken. One of the things that we've tried to do as a city is just to understand biodiversity within the city of Los Angeles. So cataloging biodiversity and then trying to help city agencies in the city as a whole, including the Department of Water and Power, understand things that they can do to ensure that we're maintaining biodiversity. So we have guidelines that are applicable to all city departments. The Department of Water and Power has a policy to maintain biodiversity, and because it's a legacy that will leave. And the one last thing I'd mention is that we're trying to learn also from other cities on how they manage biodiversity, how they manage their open spaces. So Los Angeles is one of 2 North American cities that's been invited to sit on an advisory committee on local governments and biodiversity to the executive secretary of the UN Convention on Biodiversity. So we take these efforts very seriously. We want to ensure that LA Department of Water and Power is as well. They own a lot of land, both inside the city of Los Angeles and in the surrounding areas. And that by understanding what the biodiversity is on those lands, it can help us to better manage that for now and for future generations.
I'm wondering how, there is the supporting of pollinators during this energy transition isn't always a smooth road. Different areas in the country have different views on this and different local communities. And some of the questions are around, is this important also? How do we match up supporting biodiversity and pollinators with low-income communities and equity, and making sure that we're supporting all people, across the United States. So is there, how do you guys sort of balance these issues, and do you get questions about and having to defend your commitments towards pollinators in relation to these other priorities that you have?
Well, we're fortunate in Los Angeles. We have one of the largest urban parks in the United States, Griffith Park, which is not just a park like Central Park. It's a wild land. It's undeveloped land. But that's not true for other parts of Los Angeles. And there is a direct relationship between how much concrete there is and income and environmental justice. And so looking at ways that we can use the land that we have, and again, Department of Water and Power owns a lot of facilities all across the city. Are there ways that we can use that space, co-use that space for activities that support, both the electricity and water distribution in Los Angeles, but also take advantage of that space to create more, to connect more with nature. And so we have been experimenting with the help of EPRI on pollinators and other ways to increase habitat and biodiversity and pollinators on existing properties that we have. One of our biggest challenges with climate change in Los Angeles is the urban heat island effect and increasing extreme temperatures, and restoring nature to parts of the city, either by planting trees or by planting pollinators or by letting wildlands stay wild. That can help us to address that urban heat island effect, those extreme temperatures, which are affecting our most disadvantaged communities the most.
And I'll just jump on and add to that. I totally agree with that. We look for partners because, the reality is in the regulated utility space, this is compliance driven largely. It's very hard to go beyond compliance because regulators look at it as an added cost that customers shouldn't have to pay for. It's unfortunate, but that's the way that it is. So we look for partners. And one of the things that, Nancy, you talked about is that urban heat island, right? That effect. And, we're talking to a potential partner right now that is interested in increasing the tree canopy in some disadvantaged neighborhoods around the city of Columbus, Ohio. And that's the kind of thing where, we can get involved in that. That then is owned by our local operating company. And that makes it more palatable and able to do that because it's within that jurisdiction. The corporate AEP can't come in and do those kinds of things. But you're absolutely right. There are definitely competing interests. It's cost factors, lack of understanding. It's the compliance piece. So, for example, we necessarily would not plant pollinator vegetation around solar facilities unless it's mandated by local regulations or code. And the reason is because we can't control those high growing plants that could potentially interfere with the operation of those solar panels. So we have to take those things into account. We run into the same thing at a power plant where, with landfills, those are inspected on a regular basis. And often there's requirements in place that vegetation can only be at a certain height, which may restrict the growth of pollinator vegetation. So we have a lot of challenges in front of us that we have to work our way around.
So sometimes it makes sense to support, pollinators on sites, and sometimes it doesn't. There's also some legal barriers, right, on how some requirements for vegetation height mowing. I've even seen some fire insurance requirements that are inconsistent with supporting native plants. So to meet insurance requirements, you actually can't have certain, native plants on site. So there's some things sort of embedded in insurance and regulations that are at odds with supporting biodiversity and pollinators that may need to change going forward. Do you guys have thoughts about that? And that's a tall order, to do that. Even if you could make the case on the money and the financial side, we have to also make these policy changes.
Well, I think the flip side a little bit is that, particularly in transmission rights of way in the city of Los Angeles, the Department of Water and Power has to spend a lot of money to maintain those rights of way. And if you can find either partners or things that make those rights of way have multiple benefits and multiple uses, that can help actually save money. So whether it's a pocket park, a pollinator garden, or something that's lower maintenance than coming in and having to both clean up trash as well as cut weeds and things like that. That can help. That serves a number of different purposes. So I think looking at what makes sense in your community, how you can use facilities as well. We've partnered with EPRI, for example, on trying out these vegetable gardens in a shipping container, and partnered with a local police athletic league and gotten kids involved. So there are ways to do this that I think meet multiple objectives and can actually help the utility with its maintenance and potentially save some money in the long term.
Yeah, and one of the other challenges too that we face is that we don't own those rights of ways typically. Those are owned by private landowners typically. And so, for AEP, we've got more than 40,000 miles of transmission and over 200,000 line miles of distribution. That's a lot of rights of way in 11 states. So it is very challenging. It is an option, though, when we are working with landowners to give them the option to make the investment with us and plant something different that is more eco-friendly, right? But that's not always the case, and that is another challenge. And that's why, for a lot of utilities, we tend to come down on the side of compliance because that's where we can get the cost recovery from the regulators, and that's what's it's very much like other issues. Climate change is the same way. In general, it's very hard to get past some of those local regulations or state regulators. But, sometimes those landowners can be great partners.
So, Sandy, do you think that for this, if this was to take a leap forward on biodiversity and pollinators, are you saying that for a lot of utilities, it's going to be whatever the regulations dictate and compliance requirements, and then it's sort of proceeds from there?
I think that's a starting point. I think, we're all in different places in terms of what we do, what we can do. It really, I think it's a case by case basis. I don't think there's a blanket approach to how we would do this at AEP. I mean, we've got 7 operating companies in all these different states, and every state has, their interests and what they want to do. It's very local, and that's what we have to work with. But this is something that we can bring to the table and really and advocate for it, right? So, that's really where we are.
What do you think about sort of this balance between this is required by law and regulation versus we're going to go ahead and make these decisions even if it isn't required by law?
Well, I think that's really part of the thinking. You do want to be ahead of it. We have to be compliant with regulations and so forth. But a lot of these programs that go in place today allow you sort of to pre-qualify so that if you work ahead and the entities, the environmental agencies see that you have it in your thinking, it can be easier, actually, more cost effective to move forward and get permitting and put in new infrastructure that's good for the customers, right? And so you don't want to just wait until I only want to be compliant to the letter of the law. It's better to think about it holistically, work ahead. It'll actually be more cost effective to do it that way. And you'll have a better relationship with the environmental communities if you do it that way.
And Mark, I really like your comment, which was that, these things aren't always black and white. It's not for biodiversity or against biodiversity or for this issue or that. It's oftentimes sort of this, mixed conversation about how can you get as much done as you can at one time without always going for, everything has to be perfect all the time in every site and every project.
Yeah, I think that's really important in the dialogues that we do. Once we're in conversation with the appropriate parties, is let's just explain the trade-offs. If we go this route, it might be longer, it might be more expensive, but it would be more biodiverse friendly, if you will. But, if that's too expensive and the communities feel they really can't do it, or we just can't cut through those properties, here's an alternative route. Here's how we would deal with biodiversity in that case, which might be different. We'd want to be further away from maybe some water sources, but we would just discuss what is the solution, how would we treat those lands, and what might be different about the biodiversity policy we implement there versus, another routing. So I really think as long as you keep it as part of the conversation, some appropriate degree of biodiversity will be included as you go forward.
I think one of the things that could be helpful is something that we tried to do in Los Angeles, which is just really to catalog the biodiversity and understanding. Our landscape has changed a lot in the last 150 years, but we have challenges that we can help to solve by understanding kind of what the native landscape looked like before we all showed up, and that may help with things like being resilient to wildfire, which for a lot of utilities is a big concern, particularly in the West. So I think starting from the place of just understanding what are the biodiversity attributes of the local community that you're in, and what those landscapes could be, I think can help not just utilities but communities make choices that make sense for the community, that help with resilience in the face of climate change, that help to address things like urban heat island effect that have a huge equity component to them.
Yeah, I totally agree that taking inventory of your biodiversity that your company relies upon and impacts is absolutely the first step. You got to know what your biological footprint is, right? Then you can start to figure out what projects align for a win-win for business and nature. You can establish partnerships to support those projects and capitalize on any efforts that are already underway. These are things that companies can do. And then assess and prioritize. What is it that you can do? Set a baseline, set some goals. Do you have a policy in place, that can help guide, your decision making? I know for AEP, we're getting started on this. In some ways, we're farther ahead, and in some ways, we're just starting. And I think that's the case for a lot of companies, because I don't think that, we've thought much about your biological footprint. We've thought about our carbon footprint, but now we need to put those things together and understand that they're intertwined. And so I think that's where we're headed right now. We've got to get started. We can't afford to wait any longer.
Just to kind of get some closing thoughts here, I'm really interested in your final thoughts and thinking about if you could share it, if you're optimistic or about, meeting these multiple goals by 2030 or 2035 or whatever that it is, to support people and equity and the species, either for their intrinsic value or because we depend on them and their ecosystem services. Final thoughts to share?
Well, I'd say just, like a lot of things. So first step is admitting you have a problem. I think first step is just to try to understand. And I think what's really been, which is really good is that there is this conversation happening now. I don't think it was happening, 10 or 15 years ago. And so, thinking differently about, particularly in an urban area, thinking differently about biodiversity. I think if you ask the average Los Angeles resident if Los Angeles was a biodiversity hotspot, they'd look at you like you were nuts. But it is. And I think sort of peeling back the layers a little bit of our understanding of how we interact with the landscapes around us is important. And it's important that we're having this conversation, because that will help us to do things that are beneficial, that have multiple benefits, that have benefits for operation of the utility, looking at carbon capture and soils and water retention, and how all of that can help, for example, with preventing wildfires from spreading. All of those things. I think just starting the conversation is a really good step, and it will help us get where we need to go.
So in general, I would say I'm optimistic. And the reason is we now have a much better way of bringing everybody to the table up front, have an open dialogue. We're never going to agree on everything, but we work it out, we negotiate it out. We will have some degree of biodiversity included. So we're on a path with a process where it's always being addressed, maybe not to the degree that everybody wants, but we get something in to balance it out with getting power to the customers, making sure it's affordable, that everybody can pay for it, making sure it isn't harmful to the environment. So harmful we will not do. So we'll have something in place. And so I would say optimistic that we're better at working together, looking at a total solution, exploring the alternatives, and then responsibly putting something in that serves everybody and really educating everyone, sort of expectations management. Let's all understand what we're going to be able to work out if we all work through this together.
Yeah, I'm definitely hopeful, but I do think those goals are pretty aggressive given where we are. But I do think that, it's part of the conversation more and more. It is getting traction with investors slowly but surely. And, I think it's an opportunity for us to really embrace nature-based solutions, such as ecosystem restoration, pollinators, replacing or phasing out non-native plants, those kinds of things. Many times we think of nature as something totally different. It's over there. That's nature over there. That it's very different from us, but actually we're one and the same. Think of it as a system that we're part of. And if we can understand that, yes, we are part of this system and we own it, and we have to protect it and restore it, then we can start to see the forest and not just the trees.
Well, Mark, Sandy, and Nancy, thank you very much for joining this conversation today. It was very interesting, and I think this is really going to help create a more shared understanding and a broader community about what it is to try to deliver water and power to customers across the United States while balancing these other responsibilities for biodiversity and pollinators. Thank you.